unique position in evidence policy ecosystem in Latvia. We are both users of scientific advice in policy making and supplier of knowledge and expertise through investments in scientific research. On the evidence demand side, we do our best to incorporate scientific advice into decision making on a political and administrative level, or political decision makers understand, value scientific knowledge and expertise can give. We depend on research involvement in policy discussions, and we remain open to collaboration with research institutions to deliver better policies and initiatives for education, research, use, state language, and sports. On evidence supply side, as the ministry responsible for science policy, we found a significant amount of policy relevant research advocating for better and more proactive dissemination of research findings to policymakers. We have incentives and requirements in place for research and research institutions to have meaningful impact on policy. For example, the International Assessment of Research Institutions and Policy Impact Criteria in the national research programs. As continuous communication effort, we aim to showcase success stories to motivate other researchers to produce more policy-relevant research and to encourage engagement with policymakers. At the same time, we have much to learn from UK. Our ecosystem lacks strong evidence brokers. We have few formalized mechanisms for research to affect policy. Scientific advice is often conflated with advocacy. We lack analytical capacity on the administrative level. We lack reputable and well-funded science advice networks. And we need to improve our research impact framework to support researchers in driving policy impact. I wish everyone an interesting and most importantly, evidence-based and policy-relevant discussion. Thank you.
And again, I was unmuted, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Walbert, for highlighting how important this topic is in Latvia. As Mr. State Secretary mentioned, there are two dimensions. So the demand and supply, and this is what I would like to keep in mind while we are discussing this Science for Policy topic, that there are those who are suppliers of science and evidence, and then there are those who should use it for making all of our lives better. And now, before we start with the first part of this event, kindly let me walk you through a few practical points. So I just wanted to remind you that Q&A session is going to be after both speakers have finished their lectures or presentations. Then during our Q&A session, feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions or comments, or if you prefer, just leave a comment in the chat session and we'll make sure to deliver it through to our speakers. Just a reminder that the first part is going to end around 12:50, and then we will have a 40-minute break, and at 1:30 p.m. we are going to be back with more about Science for Policy. Now, dear guests, we are officially entering the first part of the event. We are delighted to have our first guest speaker, Professor Karol Mundell, an astrophysicist, a professor of extragalactic astronomy, head of astrophysics at University of Bath, and chief scientific advisor at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Professor Mundell is also a committed communicator of science to the public. Today, Professor Mundell is going to talk about the overall frame of science advice system in UK. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, for that very warm welcome, Mr. Secretary of State, Excellency, guests. It's a great pleasure to speak to you today. So as Anna said, I would like to give you a sense of the infrastructure that we've built up over many years at the heart of government in the UK, and how that serves our policy teams and our ministers and ultimately our Prime Minister. And really, the words from, yourself, Mr. Secretary of State, about the importance of evidence at the heart of policy making, is one that chimes very much with us in the UK. And of course, in this current crisis for COVID, it's really come to the fore. So I will give a brief introduction about the wider landscape that we have. I mean, of course, the UK has a world-leading, internationally recognised science and innovation landscape. We have very strong universities, we have national academies, and they all work together within a coherent science structure. Our universities are independent of government, which is important. And so the science and the research that they do is peer-reviewed through international peer review systems. And so there's a beginning already of that trust mechanism. And trust is something that I think will run through my presentation, whether that's trust for the public for science, the trust the public have in their governments, whether governments trust their scientists. And so there's a whole web of trust that we have to keep at the back of our mind. So I, as you say, I'm a Chief Scientific Advisor. I'm one of several across government. Each government department now has a Chief Scientific Advisor, and we form a coherent network with the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance. Patrick advises the Prime Minister on all matters of science, innovation, whether that's strategic, whether that's policy related, whether that's for emergencies. And then the scientific network across government, we each have that Chief Scientific Advisor role within our government departments. So we're all in some ways similar, because we are senior representatives and heads of the government science and engineering profession. So that's civil servants who come in either through a science and engineering track to provide expert advice and work as civil servants, specifically around science and engineering analysis, evidence base, or whether, particularly in the Foreign Office, our junior civil servants join through what we call the FAST stream, that's the diplomatic stream. Some of those FAST streamers will have a science background, some of them will not. And so they're learning how to use science and scientific evidence and scientific thinking in their international diplomacy work as they develop their careers in the Foreign Office. And so each of us as CSAs, we are academics mostly. I think there are a couple of professional CSAs depending on the department. So we're on secondment. I spend 3 days a week as the Chief Scientific Advisor and 2 days a week back in academia. And I think that combination is also very important. We are on secondment into government. We are civil servants, and so we are bound by the Civil Service Code, which makes us trusted advisors to our ministers and to our policy teams. We're not there in our personal academic capacity, so I'm not an astrophysicist in the Foreign Office. I'm a Chief Scientific Advisor. I cover all of science and, of course, in the Foreign Office, all of the world, which is quite a big job. But of course, we draw scientific evidence from experts across the science portfolio. And of course, we draw on a wide range of different networks through our national academies and through our own personal networks, and also working together as a network. So the CSAs meet on a weekly basis so that we can share best practice across government, so that we can support one another on complex issues, and also work together on strategic pieces, and particularly around areas of spending and advice to our senior ministers. This mechanism has actually been in place for some time. So the Government Chief Scientific Advisor role now is many, many years in establishment. There have been several CSAs that predate Sir Patrick, and the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, I think now because of COVID, of course, Sir Patrick and Professor Chris Whitty, who's the Chief Medical Officer, have been propelled to public fame because of the COVID crisis. And we've really seen how that scientific evidence at the heart of policy making has been critical in this emergency. And we have a particular mechanism for emergencies. So Sir Patrick does advise the Prime Minister. If he feels he can advise the Prime Minister on a particular issue, he goes ahead and does that. If there is an emergency and the Cabinet Office mechanism convenes Cabinet for that emergency, and if that emergency requires complex scientific evidence, then Sir Patrick can scramble a mechanism called SAGE. So this is the Science Advisory Group in Emergencies. This is not a standing group, this is a mechanism. And so Sir Patrick has the capacity to draw on whatever kind of expertise he needs very, very quickly for the particular emergency in hand. So last year, for example, we had heavy rains in the UK, we had flooding, and there was a very large dam in Yorkshire that was at risk of collapse. And so that was a complex science and engineering emergency. There was potential for huge downstream damage and loss of life. And of course, Sir Patrick scrambled the right experts. I was not involved in that. That was a domestic emergency, and so that was not relevant for my department at that time. COVID was a very big contrast to that. Obviously, the Foreign Office was very much at the forefront of the first response to that when we first heard about this unusual illness that had broken out in Wuhan in China. And so Sir Patrick then brought together a very wide group of experts, CSAs as well as external academics, our public health department, and we started to put in place many of the mechanisms that have now started to bear fruit. So, for example, some of the random controlled trials around the different sorts of rescoping of drugs for therapeutics. So the dexamethasone study that showed that actually dexamethasone does reduce loss of life and severity of COVID. We set that right up very, very early on in the SAGE process, as well as all of the emergency planning. And so that has been a huge piece of our work this year. Unusual because normally SAGE is stood up, we provide the science advice, and then the mechanism is stood down and the policy teams take that advice forward and make their plans. But of course, SAGE has been a long running crisis, and we've actually evolved the kinds of experts that we need to bring into that mechanism over the year. We also embed this science advice mechanism within a wider scrutiny system in government. Of course, we have the select committee structure. So this is a mechanism for parliamentarians to scrutinise the work of government departments. The Science and Technology Select Committee is often the one that our CSAs will be asked to come before to provide evidence on policy decisions that have been made within departments. And so this is a very good way to connect the work that government departments do with our elected parliamentarians. And I should stress through all of this that, as CSAs, we are advisors. So we advise policy teams, and the policy teams then create the policy in collaboration with our ministers. But our ministers decide, because they are the elected representatives within our democracy, that we are advisors. We don't make the final decision. We provide the best possible evidence for the best possible decision making. We also have a group called the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. And this is a wonderful little group that sits in Parliament, and they provide evidence notes to busy parliamentarians. And this has been running now for over 20 years. All of the evidence notes are available online. And these are very deep peer-reviewed pieces of work. So the the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology are able to draw on a very, very wide range of academic experts and experts in their field. And they will do this very deep piece of science and evidence review. And then they will provide a note that is very accessible to busy parliamentarians. Obviously, before the COVID crisis, busy parliamentarians could pick one of these notes off the stand, read it on their way into the Houses of Parliament. Now all of this is online, and they're very accessible, but the parliamentarians know that they have been very deeply reviewed and peer reviewed, and so they're very robust pieces of evidence that they can just pick up on a particular policy issue that might be in their minds on a busy day. And so all of that works together at different timescales, different paces, and this is also something that the CSAs, I think, provide that's very important, because obviously our academics and our researchers and our innovators work at various different timescales, and sometimes a policy question will need a very, very fast response. And so the CSAs not only act as translators from our research community into our policy teams, but we also help to mitigate some of that pace, which is an important point. And then, of course, more broadly, in my role, obviously, I'm in the Foreign Ministry. As I say, I'm an active research scientist, and I have always worked internationally. So before I joined government, I didn't realise I was actually an international science diplomat in my own right. So the value of international scientific collaboration can't be overstated. And again, we've seen this very much to come to the fore in the COVID crisis. But this really is what pushes the frontiers of knowledge. We cannot work in science in a nationalistic way. If we look inwards, then we're not working with the best minds around the world. And it's how we learn from one another, and that collaboration is incredibly important. And so my role really within the Foreign Office, in parallel to the core CSA roles, is really to put science at the heart of diplomacy. And so we have science in diplomacy. This may be for international issues that we want to bring the best possible scientific evidence to the table. And I often speak with other chief scientific advisors from foreign ministries around the world. And that's a very, very important and powerful mechanism to be able to communicate with other science advisors around the world. And so governments that don't have science advisors have been very keen recently to think about how to step up this function. And that again provides some extra resilience to the international science advice system. There's also science for diplomacy, building new friendships with new countries through the science advice mechanism. And then finally, diplomacy for our scientists. And I say science in the widest sense. Often our researchers will want to build new relationships with stakeholders in different countries, but they'll not know how to connect. And this is where our embassies are critically important. And our ambassador mentioned the importance of the Science and Innovation Network, who've worked so hard to put this event together today. And the Science and Innovation Network, I think, is possibly unique in the world. So we have over 100 science and innovation attaches covering over 50 countries in the UK, around the world. And we lead those from London, and they're embedded in our embassies, and they support our ambassadors, first of all, to make sure that they have the best access to the best scientific evidence for their daily work and also for their strategic work when they're developing their in-country strategies, but also as a portal to help connect UK researchers and innovators with like-minded people who they want to work with in new countries where they may not know necessarily how to connect or how the systems work there. So that's incredibly important for our collaborations, for prosperity, and also for our security. So it's been a great pleasure to speak to you today, and I hope that's given you a whirlwind tour of our science advice mechanisms, which we're always evolving and reforming and learning from what we've done well and what we could do better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we move on, and taking into consideration that by our schedule we still have like 10 minutes, let me be the one to ask you some questions. Since you mentioned different networks and how reacting quickly is so important for making decisions during emergencies, but maybe not so related to that. Is it science in a policy or science for policy?
Well, that's a really important question. I think it's both. So it may be that there is an issue for which you need a scientific question. And you may then draw on the best possible evidence there. So, for example, I chair a committee, or I oversee a committee for one of our overseas territories, the island of Montserrat. And the island was, 2/3 of the island was destroyed in 1995 because of the volcano. So the island basically sits on the top of a volcano. And so we have a science advisory group that is made of world-leading experts literally from around the world on fluid dynamics, on volcanoes, on monitoring. And they work very hard to make sure that we can keep the island safe, and that we have monitors that's embedded across the island. So there's lots of really frontline science that is done and has been done for many years, studying the status of that volcano, because it really impacts people's lives on the island. There's a large exclusion zone where people are not allowed to go, and obviously that then impacts the prosperity of the island, tourism, and the ability to work and live in the island. And so that science advisory group works very, very hard to provide really cutting edge real-time science advice. The role that I have is to support our governor on the island, who in turn supports the Montserrat government, to make sure that all of the operations connection then from that science, the core research that goes on out through across the island, to make sure that all of the emergency response systems are in place. The island also experiences hurricanes. And so, one example was looking at the data, seeing there's a gap in the monitoring data and realizing it was because the hurricane season took out all of the sensors on the island. And so that's really where you are bringing that science, real, cutting edge frontier science, particularly for that problem, into that wider evidence piece. But there's also the scientific method. And so when you're trying to answer a question, because obviously government creates evidence as well, I shouldn't give the impression that it's only external advisors or scientists that provide evidence. We have many policy experts across government who are experts in their own right. They will be generalists. They will have moved from different portfolios. I think our diplomats are a really good example of this. So our diplomats, are experts in their fields, and they bring vast amounts of intelligence and knowledge back to London, which we, of course, then you need to deploy in different ways. So I think evidence in the broader sense, we can interrogate that using the scientific method. So if we're making a decision or we're answering a question, what are the underlying assumptions that we're making when we're developing those policy choices. So, you know, I think sometimes when you say science, people think of somebody in a lab with a white coat. It's in the broadest sense. How do we make sure that we make robust evidence-based decisions and we challenge the assumptions to make sure that those policy options that we provide to our ministers and our parliamentarians have been looked at from every angle. So it's a very wide piece. And I think finally, you know, that the other big issue really is data. And making sure that our policy experts are equipped with the right tools to be able to interrogate data, to be able to understand some of the biases that lie under the data, and to really use those data to get a new insight into some of the problems and the issues that we're tackling. So that's almost a downstream scientific application. It's not foundational science that you might think of in a lab or a university department, but it's using the tools of science to help that interface with policy.
Thank you so much. I think the topic you touched upon, that using scientific methods in decision-making, any decision-making process, is very, very important into governing and policy-making processes. I was unmuted again. Thank you, Professor Mundell, for an enlightening speech. I am sure that this is going to serve as a great basis for our question and answer session. But now we are proceeding with our next guest speaker, Vice Rector for Research of Riga Technical University, Professor Talis Juchna. Not only he is a professor of water technology at Riga Technical University, but also Professor Juchna has had a great deal in the COVID-19 research, as he led one of the high readiness projects in the National Research Program, COVID-19 mitigation. Please, Talis.
Thank you. Now I'm unmuted again. Thank you again. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Ambassador and the Ministry for this opportunity for me to reflect on the policy of, or rather how the science is being used in policy of Latvia. I would like to say that has been a big challenge for me, because I have to admit I'm not a political scientist. I'm not really advisor, and my background is more, as it was said, in engineering and also in administration. So I was a bit puzzled at the beginning, but then when I went through the existing, let's say, documents on scientific policy, it is very clearly stated that you have to take into account different perspectives from different sciences. So maybe that would be my modest contribution, or reflecting on a few of the, let's say, issues in Latvia regarding how the science is being used in policy. So what I'm going to do, I did a little bit of kind of ethnographic study on different ways I have been interacting with policy. So it's more at macro level. As it was mentioned that I'm leading one of the COVID projects, but also as a micro level, as a vice rector for research at Technical University. So I think that has already been said that, I mean, this period, especially during the COVID crisis, is extremely important in terms of receiving a substantial base for decisions. So the evidence-based solutions are absolutely necessary now, especially when we are talking about growing, new forms of populism and also opening the data. So I think it goes without saying. Regarding Latvia, I think that we have to say few kind of issues regarding Latvian policy, because first of all, we are in continuous process of changing the policy. So we are now, right now, both in scientific and higher education system, there's a substantial changes are going on. So just to take into account, this is not something stagnant. So it's been changing over the time. Second, I would like to emphasize that my feeling, again, is my personal feeling, is that we're still in the value transition period. So our values about role of science for the policy in general, but also in some specific questions are not clearly defined. Maybe they will never be clearly defined, but just to give an example, for example, when we have discussion about role of international experts in evaluating the scientific, let's say, grants. So we still, there's been a lot of debate about it. So I think that's a sign of this transition kind of period we are going through. And also based on some studies, it has been shown that Latvians in general, they have relatively low satisfaction with democracy in general and the low participation in democracy. There's one of the studies just published recently. So I think we have to take this into account when we talk about policy in general. So now about my experience, as I said, I'm a scientist myself. So I have established a research lab when I came back from Sweden. I have a PhD from Sweden in environmental engineering, and then have really hands-on experience how to build your scientific unit from scratch. Second is that, as it was mentioned, I'm working as a vice director for research. Basically, I'm responsible for innovation and research at Riga Technical University, which is the largest technical university in the region. And so what I'm managed is to introduce the kind of lean process in way we distribute funding in university. So the last is that I've also been working at the National Science Council, helping to introduce grant funding system, which we are using right now. And finally, as it was mentioned, also in charge of one of the college research programs. So starting a little bit of basis, I think that is already mentioned by previous speakers, that there are some guiding principles in place. So perhaps we will not reinvent the wheel here in Latvia. These are the two organizations, and I went through the documents, what they actually now pushing forward. So they're talking about Science Policy 2.1. GSC has developed a very comprehensive manuscript about how this should be done in the European level. So as I went through that, I realized that there are some kind of guiding principles. So in my short speech, I would like to reflect to these guiding principles regarding my experience in three major activities. The first is about the COVID project, then again about my experience working at National Council of Science, and also as university vice rector. So, but just to go in that, I would like to just make very clear. I mean, those who are working in field of science, they know that scientific method is not applicable directly to solve complex or what we call it, wicked problems, which are policy. So basically, scientific method is a bit different, but the major challenge is how to use this scientific approach and to apply it in very specific situations. So that's why I think it's this is a biggest problem, or the challenge for the policy makers, really to use scientific advice in the right situation and then time. So because I mean, if you talk about the complex problem, then they're always open-ended. There's an issue about ethical, let's say, consideration of different stakeholders. They are more design-based problems, and they always include many stakeholders. As for scientists, I mean, if you talk about scientific method, that I think they are mostly based on hypothesis testing, and I would say they're more individual. So if we come back to the overall principles, what I was mentioning, I actually came across 3 challenges and 3 solutions from the documents I was just referring to. The first is, of course, nothing has changed. I mean, that scientific-based solutions is something we need, or rather evidence solutions, something what we need. And very important role in that is actually to so-called border science policy organizations, which could be organizations as such, independent, but they also could be part of, let's say, ministry or university, etc. So these are the kind of 2 things I think which always been addressed in these new policy documents. And one of the challenge which I came across is that what we call it epistemological asymmetry, meaning that you have scientists that are experts in the field. So the question is how the policymakers select scientists, because that the level of knowledge for the particular area is very different. So it's very difficult to say if this is the right expert. And then, of course, we have to be honest that the scientists, they also can be biased. They can be biased both, they are overconfident, they could be from different fields, they maybe are looking too narrow to the problem. The third problem, what is important, is how to balance between, let's say, scientific decisions and decisions made by the public, I mean, by democracy. So this is always a trade-off. So regarding solutions, again, 3 major things. I think it was mentioned before already, the trust. I mean, without the trust and as a, the value of trust as a kind of social capital is very difficult to move forward. So the building of trust is very important. As it also was said before, the scientific excellence, when we talk about advice, so this should be very clear that this advice is based on good science. It's good on excellent science. And finally, the third is that when we talk about scientific advisors, then we have to diversify. We have to have scientists from different fields, not maybe from just one. That's what I was mentioning about maybe role of fundamental engineering science in policy making as well. So the border organizations, I think it's one of the challenges that how really to place them correctly in the system, how to balance this independent decision and the strategy from the political point of view, because I mean the policy is driven by the political parties, and on one hand you want to have a decision which is a science-based, on the other hand you have a strategy you need to implement. So how to balance these 2, and the finally is, I think it's very important that the funding model, how to really fund this enterprise in general. So now I will go through 3 examples, and then I will come up with my, let's say, few conclusions about how the general principles are being used in Latvia. So first of all, my experience about National Council. I was working there for about 4 years, and I think that what Council did in cooperation with ministry and with many scientists is that we managed to implement a new system, how the scientific projects are evaluated. And there are some of the, let's say, points what I think are important, why this, let's say, process was successful, well, at least subjectively successful, because I think there's the number of complaints about evaluation of the projects are relatively low. So maybe this is one of the kind of criteria. So first of all, I think what we see is that the head of this organization had a very good reputation, both at the ministry and also in scientific community. So the second is that when the overall principles were formulated about the scientific, the expertise, there's been a vast discussion between different stakeholders. So it took some time really, but then when the concepts were formulated, more or less the strategy were not changed. Third is that the funding distribution, the formula, how we distribute it, I think it was very clear and measurable. I mean, meaning that even how we distribute between different scientific fields was integrated in this formula. And the number 4 is that experts who are actually selecting the experts for evaluating projects, they had a scientific background. This is something I mentioned already about this epistemological asymmetry. I mean, this is addressing this kind of issue because the experts, the ones who are selecting experts are scientists, formal scientists themselves. And I think that another outcome which we learn from this exercise is that the panel or the expert panels are very useful because this is open forum for discussion and is better than just kind of average opinion from few experts and then drawing, let's say, the average mark. Now, about national grants. So yes, I think we, this was a really heroic work done by many scientists because in period of 6 months, we managed, I mean almost 50% of institutions, I think even more were involved in this program. But they managed to deliver, I think, very tangible results. And the reason I think why, one of the important points I think is that the scientific groups were engaged in formulating the problems at the very beginning. So, and then when this overall principles or the themes were defined, then it went through the several filters, so to say, so that the ones who are actually coming with idea are not directly involved in evaluation of this idea. I think this was also important. And what we have proved actually is that in formulating the consortiums for these projects, just one example, more than 100 scientists were actually discussing in online forums to define what are the consortiums. I think it shows that it's actually possible to kind of organize the scientific groups in a relatively short time frame if the objective is very clear. And the last, my experience in university, well, at the university, the way we distribute funding. So it has been a big change, something like 5 years ago. And we decided that the funding will be based on very simple, measurable KPIs. So the way we spread this funding between the faculties. And one of the kind of take-home messages was that when we decided this, we have this framework of 5 years, and we said within the 5 years, we will move from 10% of, let's say, the 10% of this system to 70% of using the system. So, and then, so within this time frame, there were no changes. Also, there's a lot of discussion about maybe we need to change something like, or improve something, but we said, no, we stayed on that. And in period of 5 years, actually system adapted. So if you have a really very clear horizon and a clear system how you, define your objectives, then there's the system adapts themselves, and I think it works very good now. So to conclude, few of my kind of recommendation observations rather. The first. I think the role of so-called border organization is absolutely important. And what is also important is to have a good blend between different experts from different scientific fields. And I think it's also important that we have to kind of have a different personnel involved in the permanent positions, the ones who are actually providing, for example, selecting experts, evaluating different projects. So they have to have a scientific background, but they should not be active scientists just to limit, let's say, conflict of interest. But the scientists could be involved in ad hoc type of advisors to this expert committee. Next, what I think more from political point of view is important is to have a clear message of policy makers about the policy in general. By this, I mean that we have to be very kind of vocal about what is the overall principle of what we are following in the next 5 years. For example, we say, okay, now the funding, scientific funding is mostly based on project. So we then have to clearly communicate that. And based on that, we could, well, the policymakers should make a very clear KPIs. So if this kind of approach will be used, then results will be tangible, measurable. And I think that would provide more clarity for scientists also building their careers and their strategy is at university. And finally, a few more things. I think that clear filters, we call it filters between policymakers and implementers are needed. So basically you have to separate the ones who are realizing projects and giving advice and the ones who are evaluating, which was an example from National Council. Long-term perspective, again, for the policy, as I said, it's absolutely necessary and to have less kind of ad hoc type of changes. And the way the border organizations, science and policy maker organization are organized is very important. And finally, I think we need also from scientific kind of domain champions, people who are actually actively involved in policy making. And this is also very important that they have a reputation among scientific community. So they have also kind of mandate to talk to the politicians and in this way execute let's say, the overall values of scientific community. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor, for elaborating on the challenges. I would say those are some challenges that Latvia faces in the journey towards great science advisory system. I would like to ask you a question right ahead, if it's okay, of course. Would you say that we're talking a lot about emergency situations and how science has to work for policy during hardships. So would you say that COVID-19 pandemic has been a showcase on how important evidence-based decisions are in shaping our everyday life?
Well, I think that at least from a scientific community, I mean, the example I mentioned about, you know, that scientists were able to mobilize from other actually projects, because then we have up-running projects to mobilize and in very short time, really to come up with, you know, real solutions. I think it shows that scientific community is ready to participate. So the question is, you know, how clearly the objective is defined. So in this case, it was very clear. I mean, the public was expecting, you know, very tangible solutions. So I think that this is a good example that if the objective is clear, then scientific community itself is able to mobilize and, let's say, formulate both what are the specific questions and also address them in a very scientific manner.
Thank you. And you mentioned formulating like questions, asking the right questions and deciding on how to give answers to that. Can I ask you shortly to elaborate, please, on who should be who should make the questions, who should come up with the questions, who should be involved in this whole question making process? Because it's not only providing evidence, we have to have these clear questions in mind when we want to use science for policy.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and as I mentioned during my presentation, I think it's at this stage, when you have to really define what is the question, then you have to engage as diverse as possible, scientific both community and also the public in discussion. So in the early stage, that you have to have a very different opinions. But then, as you know, you are coming closer to, let's say, what is the question, then there's individual experts should be engaged. So it's kind of you have to channel from very broad perspective to specific question. But when the questions are placed, then of course that is actually I would say the role of this border organization, science and policy maker border organization, because of course that we scientists have different interests, but that decision should be separated from our interest.
Thank you. Professor Mundell, do you have any comment on this question about who is making the questions and who should answer them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right that it's a process, and I think also what's important when one is gathering the scientific evidence and synthesizing it, that sometimes also helps you to shape the question. But I think it's also as important as the answer is actually saying what we don't know, what we need to know, and what we're trying to do in order to find out what we don't know. And I think that's one of the real challenges between the culture of policy and the culture of scientific research. And, as you showed very nicely on your slides, Vice Rector, there, the fact that you have this driver in the scientific community, as scientists, we're often very single-minded. You wrote hubris, and, you could think of those words, but that's the reward system, is that we are rewarded on our excellence. And that's important because we have to develop our career and our scientific excellence and our reputation and that of our group or our university and then ultimately our country. And I think that's quite a different culture to, policy teams who are working in the general, and they're actually potentially at a very fast pace trying to draw in almost what is the question, what are we tackling here? That's separate to the strategic piece, I think. And so when we bring science in, often we'll be asked as science advisors a question and we may come back and say, well, let me think about that question, make me think whether we can ask that question in a different way. Or actually, if I give a very simple answer like yes or no, that tiny little word can be loaded with so much work behind it. How did I reach that answer? What does that answer mean? Is it a yes but or yes so far? If we're working at the frontiers of knowledge, and I think COVID was a very good example of this, that you're working at the frontiers of knowledge, and the knowledge will evolve and change as you do more work, whether it's you as a group, an individual, the world, the scientific community working together. And I think that scientific integrity, when we're doing that evidence synthesis, it's also important not to be too quick. Actually, you may try to give an answer, but actually you have to look at the integrity of the research papers. Internationally, the publication industry, of course, sped up all their processes, but journals were very keen that they maintained the quality of the publications, even though they were speeding up. Peer review was very important, making sure that there weren't conflicts of interest. And same as, you discussed on the scientific funding side, making sure that nobody looks, and whether there's a conflict of interest or whether there's a perception of conflict of interest, both of those can impact trust and the integrity of the material that we then take into the advice process. And I think certainly through the emergency, through COVID, the questions that we were formulating were forward thinking. Because we were moving from a position where we had some data emerging from China in a live situation. It was wonderful that the Chinese authorities made the full sequencing of the genome publicly available, so teams around the world could work independently on creating the right kinds of tests, and ultimately our vaccine research groups could work very quickly. But of course, those scientists were working on a basis of years and decades in some cases of their personal research. You don't just switch a vaccine solution on overnight. You do that on the basis of 20 odd years worth of research. And so I think, when you start to say, what is the question that we might want to ask a month into this crisis or 2 months into this crisis, when you have actually no sense of how that crisis will unfold, that's equally important, so that you're not always playing catch up.
Thank you. I just wanted to tell everyone here that you can ask your questions. If you raise a hand, I will try to allow you to unmute yourself. And if you do not want to speak, then just write in your question in the chat, and we will make sure to read that question aloud. Meanwhile, while we are waiting for questions, I wanted to ask about the, some say that maybe science policy is only for emergency situations only, and this is a great way to and this is a great way to power punch through this whole emergency situation. Is it so? Could you comment on this, Vitalis, Yugna, or Mandel?
No. Of course, yeah. Sorry. So,
no, you go ahead. I think we both have the same answer.
Yeah, yeah. Of course. I mean, of course, the question is not just now. I mean, I think that maybe it's even more important when we are not in crisis, because that allows you to give a little bit more time and build the evidence base. So certainly not. And as I said in my presentation, so how to find a balance between this technocratic, more, let's say, scientific approach and that what public wants. I think this is the biggest challenge. But for this, you need really very clear way to communicate to the public and for policy makers to make very transparent and clear strategy, how we are going to do this. So, and then the science will be very useful in also helping to make the policy.
Yeah, and I think it's also part of the whole ecosystem because, of course, in the UK, much of our research is publicly funded and that's taxpayers' money. And so there is a whole system to peer review the science, make sure it's world leading, make sure it's not conflicted, the integrity is in the system, and also to measure the impact of that research over, a medium and a long-term timescale. And then how we bring the quality of that science and the impact of it nationally and internationally into the government process, when obviously, the government will be looking to allocate funding. And we've just been through a spending review in the UK, and that sets the funding for government departments as well as, out across communities. And so we all have to make the case for that funding, and there has to be a good value for money argument about that. So the bigger the impact you have to improve people's lives, as you said at the beginning, and also, more broadly, our place in the world, then the more justification you have for spending, our taxpayers' dollars, if you like, and making sure that benefit comes back to our communities in the short, medium and long term. And so I think that's also where the science advisors within government have a really important role to play. Again, we're making that bridge, sometimes foundational research. It will be 20, 30, 50 years before that has an impact. And when we look at things like emerging technologies, government also has a really important role to play in terms of the standards and the regulatory frameworks in which science and engineering and innovation develops. So we want to make sure that we enable prosperity, but we also need to do that in a safe and secure way. And so, we have many wonderful scientists working in our labs and our engineers working. And, you look and you think, well, they will focus on their work. But the government's role, in my opinion, is to make sure that that's done in a safe way and to be very foresightful about it. Because often, when we think of the disruptions that come from technology, both good and bad, that is a wider societal conversation. Ethics around artificial intelligence, for example, and bioengineering and genetic modification. These have to be conversations that we have within wider society. And we have to help our scientists communicate and engage with the public, as you say, outside of times of crisis, so that we have a well-educated population who can be fully engaged in those decisions, as we develop them.
Thank you. We do have one question, and I'm going to ask you to unmute, and then please introduce yourself, and maybe if you can, then say to whom you're addressing your question to.
May I ask, I don't understand clearly, Andris Stamper, I'm from Institute of Solid State Physics. On such a point, maybe we have to somehow also to motivate or to push politicians understand that no, we have some changes and also some changes in our priorities in Horizon Europe program. It's also maybe UK will stay, I hope, with Horizon Europe also in scientific program. Also Horizon, also the Europa Green Deal. And there are these priorities because they are changing, and we are how to think that maybe we need also to push politicians to understand that we have to maybe more invest in some such like in medicine, energy, and then for society. And this is also one of the points, because important program for research program Horizon, it was a little bit different. This, different aims and different priorities. I think it's very important also for every politicians, every politics understand that national and other funding, research, innovation actions should be to also to address the number of topics which are important, not only maybe for each country, but for all Europe.
So if I understand correctly, you are asking how to increase the demand for science using policy decision-making process.
Maybe I can take it. Thank you, Ans. I understand. You know, the question is that it's actually comes back to the whole idea of well, we call it smart specialization. You know, which areas we will be mostly looking at. And I think one of the issue what Professor Steinberg is mentioning is that you have some, let's say, global challenges at European level. And then we have our, let's say, the way we find these fields of specialization. So how to really, you know, kind of, you know, find a balance between, again, those two. Because, you know, if you talk about the Green Deal, it's a global issue, but then we have our, let's say, more narrow specific questions. And when we defined our scientific policy, so how to take into account both global and local priorities. And I think it's not, I agree, it's not really clearly defined, because we are part of the world and we have to deal with the green technologies and so on. So it's not really clearly defined in our scientific priority list yet. So I think this is an issue, and I agree, this is something what we need to, especially politicians need to address, so to make sure that we are part of global scientific community by addressing these global issues.
And perhaps I could add, the UK has, I guess, looked at this over many years. It's the top-down versus the bottom-up question. So, you know, researcher-driven projects versus strategic programs from the top down. And recently, you know, within the UK funding mechanism, we had things called sector deals. And, you know, there were large investments, you know, for particular big thematic areas. We have a research council funding structure that's set up such that there are individual funding research councils that cover particular science areas. So the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, Biology and Biosciences, and they sit under an umbrella organisation called UK Research and Innovation. We also have our Innovation Council, all part of that. And so all of those subject-specific funding agencies speak to their communities. Funding is provided to that top-level organisation. And so all of our normal scientific peer review, if you like, happens in that process. But then, of course, government can then announce funding mechanisms that will cut across all of that so that it's interdisciplinary. So these big global challenges. And that was something that was a really interesting process to see happening, because I'm an on-the-ground scientist, and I know the science that I want to do, and I can see those responsive mode funding calls that I want to respond to. And then, you know, looking into Europe, I've seen this throughout my career. You know, I see a tender for, say, nanotechnology solutions to something or other, and I think, well, that's not what I do. I'm an astrophysicist, and I go back to the lab and think about black holes. But actually what we found in the UK was by driving that top down with the bottom up, scientists were able to mobilize and actually work in a much more interdisciplinary way. So they could still work in a way that was authentic to them as individuals or for their research groups, but they could see how to apply their science to a bigger problem. And when that funding mechanism was designed in an agile way, it really drove, you know, genuine innovation and a bigger increase in the capacity of the science that was being done by individual disciplines. And so I've seen that work very well in the UK context. I think in the European-wide context, again, through my career, I've seen these European programs change and evolve. You know, we've the FP5s and 6s and 7s and, you know, Horizon 2020. And I think one of the big challenges for countries within that mechanism is to see your priorities reflected in those big priorities. And of course, you know, that becomes a political issue sometimes, but I think scientists have that influence across that mechanism, but also looking to see how you would engage with those top level strategies, because there can often be really creative ways to do that. And, you know, I agree completely with Talis in terms of the global challenges that we have. We can think in our bunkers. But actually, when we think of climate change as, you know, the biggest challenge of our generation, there are so many ways that we have to come together and tackle that. And it dwarfs everything else. The pandemic, you know, currently is just a small thing compared to the challenges of climate change. And I think you're right that our policymakers and our politicians are not the ones to set the questions there. They set the problems. They can see the problems. We've provided the scientific data from the bottom up to show that the problem exists. And we now need to go ahead and find those solutions and bring every piece of our research and innovation culture to bear on the problem. And it's often, we know in science, it's something that we don't expect or we don't think sits in this field is often the one that is the game changer. And you're absolutely right, it has to be done globally. It can't just be done in a nationalistic or a regional way.
Thank you. We have another question in our chat section, and it's addressed to Professor Mundell. How would you comment on the role and involvement of the Royal Society in decision-making processes in the UK?
Yeah, so the Royal Society is our National Academy of Sciences. Very, very important, a very illustrious body established in 1660. So it's been around for a long time. Interesting thing is, although it's very aged and illustrious, it has reformed continually over the centuries. And so it's a very modern organization. The Royal Society is important in a number of different ways. It is a fellowship for illustrious and well-recognized leaders in their field, which is important. So it's very prestigious to be a fellow of the Royal Society. They're also provided with a modest amount of research funding from the government, so that they use for research fellowships. And so they have a very, very competitive process where they appoint the world leaders and young research scientists in their field. People can apply from all over the world to host one of these fellowships within a UK university. These are called University Research Fellowships. So that's long-term sustainable funding, 5 potentially to 10 years, depending on how one uses the fellowship. And there are a number of other fellowship schemes that they run to support different researchers at different stages of their careers. So that's entirely done, again, through excellence. That's the single criteria that they have there. They also have a number of other funding programs, depending on the funding priorities that come from government. And so, for example, around the development area, so they've had a number of programs using overseas development aid funding that then goes in to support scientific research in partnership with countries that have a development agenda. And so that's a very focused program. And they also have a policy team and an international outreach team. I believe the Royal Society had a foreign secretary before the UK government did. So they have a very, very big international profile. Of course, they connect with national academies of science around the world. And that also helps to support that science ecosystem. And they also provide policy papers. So they're often very much ahead of thinking. And so they run these 2-day meetings where world leading experts will come together and discuss a particular scientific topic, and then they will write a policy paper from that. So we find that very useful in government to be able to read these synthesis papers from the cutting edge, and we can then make sure that we have that advice sitting again within our advice pool for policymaking.
Thank you. We have another question from our colleague Alexandros.
Yes, hello. My name is Alexandros. I work in the ministry, and I'll be speaking in the next half of the event. So I think there will be like a more in-depth introduction then. But I also have a question to Professor Mundell. So to what extent do informal networks compete with the chief scientific advisors, especially when it comes to engaging political decision makers and giving advice to political decision makers?
I think it depends how you define informal networks. The CSAs use our informal networks. Of course, you know, we are networked. We are leading scientists in our own right. And many of us have worked at the policy interface from the scientific side as well. We've often, you know, been embedded in those national and international structures and advisory boards. And so I think the network's really important, but I think for government, what's really important is transparency. So, you know, the scientists and the experts who've engaged with SAGE for the COVID crisis, we've published the names with their permission on our government website. And, you know, we published the minutes of our meetings. So I think transparency is very important. I think when when one is reaching out to informal networks, the key is that it's information gathering and it's not an influence on decision making. So for example, you know, again, as Talis said, I wouldn't reach out to an informal network and then immediately provide somebody with a grant. That would be entirely inappropriate. All of the grant making processes are completely independent and sit within our research councils and are done through open, transparent peer review processes. So I think that integrity is very, very important. But as I say, we connect out through our national academies. And often we will work with our national academies to make sure that they can provide us with the right experts if we don't necessarily have a full sight of the kind of experts that we want some information from. So our professional bodies, the Institute of Physics, British Academy, you know, they are hubs to reach out into a much broader community. So I think that the more voices we hear, and the broader and more comprehensive the evidences that we're gathering and the thinking that we're gathering, then the better the synthesis will be when we put it together. Nothing's ever perfect. I'm sure we'll always miss somebody's voice, but we do our best to keep that agile, and also not at times of crisis and not at times of strategy making. We will often run small workshops. The Foreign Office, for example, has an organisation called Wilton Park, which we support, and they bring in stakeholders from, you know, across all sorts of different industries, nationally and internationally, to do brainstorming and workshopping around particular big policy issues. And so it doesn't necessarily just have to be through the Chief Scientific Advisors Network.
Thank you. It seems like we don't have any more questions, so I'm going to jump right in and ask more questions. This one is addressed to Professor Juchna. You talked a little bit about trust, and Professor Mundell talked about trust quite a lot. So the question is, who are the ones who should be working on building trust? Is the question clear? I cannot understand from your facial expression.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's an interesting question, because, you know, I think that this is kind of everyone should work on their ability to provide trust, I would say. I mean, this is not, you cannot make a formal organization to build on, you know, to work on building trust. I think one example, what I mentioned also in my presentation, is that we need some kind of champions, you know, the people who are actually showing good examples. And then people will follow example. I'm not saying about, you know, some kind of very populistic type of, you know, individuals. I'm talking about the scientists who have actually dedicated their time, their energy, and then through their efforts, they showed example that you can trust this particular, let's say, leader of organization, for example, right? So, and then people see that, you know, that this is something that this person we can trust, and then our observation is that they start to believe in the person, and they will get followers as well. I don't know if answer this, but I think it's more through individuals rather than to make some kind of formal, you know, way. I don't know, some kind of exercise type of things I don't have in mind. I think it's rather through individual example and showing good examples for public, and then people will follow.
And I think if I could add, I think it's also the systems, absolutely everybody, but explanation is really important. Understanding motivations. I think something as simple as making one's funding sources entirely transparent. Every time one writes a research paper, you acknowledge who you're funded by. Obviously, if one comes along and says, I have this particular scientific position, and then it's found after the fact that there's been some conflict of interest with funding or some perceived conflict of interest, then I think that undermines people's trust. I think there's distrust and there's mistrust. So there's the kind of the hesitancy of, I'm not quite sure I know you, or I know what you're about, or I know what this system is. And the more I learn, the more I'll have confidence in that system. And then I will assume that what comes out of that system is robust, versus distrust, where there's actually misinformation that gets sown and disinformation that's spread. And this is a big problem for us, I think, internationally, that there will be people, of course, and agencies who will not want that trust to be established for their own, purposes. And I think that is a big challenge for governments around the world and stakeholders and bodies to actually say, how do we maintain the integrity in our system, and how do we communicate in all sorts of different ways that the system does have that integrity. And I think, from things like public health, we know that working with local stakeholders, trusted stakeholders within local communities is important. Sometimes messaging from central government, doesn't land well in local communities depending on their personal experiences. Scientists, I've certainly found, when they're speaking in a humble way about the science that they're doing, I think that's very different to pitching for funding or saying, I have a particular ideological position and I've moved away from my area of expertise. But, for example, Professor Sarah Gilbert, who's leading the UK vaccine, she is an incredible communicator. She's a very busy lady because she's finding a vaccine for the COVID crisis, of course. But when she comes onto, the TV and is interviewed by journalists, she's so measured and clear. She provides understanding. And I think that's where the trust is built. She literally helps people to understand how the virus works and how the vaccine works. And it's very, very powerful and stark when you see that kind of communication. There's nothing else with it. It's simple, it's powerful, and everybody says, oh, okay, I get that, I understand it. I can internalize that in a way that works for me. So yeah, it's an area of research as well. So I know social psychologists around the world work on trust as a frontier of research, actually. So it's not a simple thing.
It definitely sounds like we have to work on more and more with science communication and communicating the knowledge we have with other people. So not only politicians, not only policymakers, but also like general public, just because we know that our politicians are the mirror of ourselves, right? So if there is trust in scientists, in general public, then we can be sure that science is going to play a bigger role in policy making. Are there any other questions or comments from our participants? If not, then I will proceed with one or two more questions. We don't have a lot of time left. One question is that we all know that science takes a lot of time, and not always we have this time. Sometimes we have to make decisions, not tomorrow, but in a year's time, and we know that to gather evidence, it would take more time than we actually have. And is there a way to deal with educated guesses from experts or I'm trying to put this in some way. So sometimes we ask opinions to experts, researchers on some specific topic that we don't have answers to. How do we deal with this time difference in when we have to make a decision and how when we have evidence?
I think you should ask different experts. That's my answer. You should ask different experts because, as I mentioned, this is one of the challenges also, that experts can be biased. I mentioned the hubris problem. You have Nobel Prize winners talking about pseudoscience. And you have you have plenty of examples like that, and then you should be very careful about it. Even he has all the merits, scientific merits. It not always mean that he's really within his domain. He talks about maybe something he is not expert. So my advice would be ask 2 or 3 experts, and then it's your intelligent guess whom you believe, so to say, if believe is the right word in this situation.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the diversity of responses that you pull together is important. I think also, when it is, you said earlier on about a wicked problem. I think we know that we have examples of things that we've worked on before as scientists, and so we can use analogies. I mean, the coronavirus was a very good example. I was listening to one of our experts describe about the work that she had done on different kinds of coronaviruses, a very specific answer to a question, but she could then work forward, not necessarily to answer at that point in time how SARS-CoV-2 would work, but the kinds of things that we would look out for, particularly around things like antibodies, whether they would be binding, whether they'd be neutralizing, how that would then manifest in the disease path. So at that point, we were given that insight that she had that experience and her team had that expertise from previous work that they had done. She didn't have the actual answer for this particular virus, but we knew that she was working in the right way on that. And I think the other thing that we did around COVID was we were able to work very quickly with our funding agencies to step up emergency research funding. And, so we talked earlier on today about the world community sort of mobilizing to solve this big crisis in all sorts of interesting and creative ways that they maybe wouldn't have thought that they would have done in the past, from our physicists through to our engineers and our bioscientists, but also making that funding available, again, through peer review, so all robustly done, but done at pace, made sure that we had the infrastructure so we weren't just randomly asking a question and making a best guess. And I think the other thing that I've seen work very well on SAGE are the confidence limits. So all of our consensus statements that come from synthesis of evidence, and often the scientists in SAGE will be doing that research over the weekend and evening to provide answers on the Monday morning. That synthesis and that environment to be able to have those scientists, when they don't agree necessarily, they will come up with different answers and they will have to compare their methods. We give them a safe space to do that. They bring that consensus response towards to the main group, and again we then provide that challenge, being able to say, we think this is the answer, but with low confidence, and this is what we're doing to find out more, or we think this with high confidence, also really helps to colour that policy decision rather than a black and white, it's a yes or a no. And it also helps to deal with the hubris issue or the very narrow focus. But absolutely, I think Sir Paul Nurse, who is a Nobel Prize winner, ex-president of the Royal Society, calls it Nobelitis. Just because I've got a Nobel Prize doesn't mean I know about everything. So.
We have a minute left, and this is the time I wanted to make sure that you got your message through. And if you have any other comments about this topic, please do share them.
And maybe I could just finish by thanking you for this wonderful opportunity and a wonderful organisation. And I think what these sorts of events show, it's difficult not to be able to meet in person, but I think the technological transformation we've had to bring to bear during this crisis has made, for me, the world feel smaller and friendlier. And I think connections internationally, nationally, locally, communicate, be humble, speak to one another and connect, create those connections. I think that's how we will solve the biggest problems of the day, and we will keep that trust and we will grow that trust by those people-to-people connections. Thank you.
I would also add that this is actually maybe an opportunity for us, the crisis where we are right now, to connect with experts from and leaders, opinion leaders from different countries. And I think I'd like to also thank them for this opportunity, because I think at the end of the day, we're talking about the same thing. It's just the same thing. It's just the way we are approaching it. And in these kind of forums allow us to more be confident about the way we are actually going. And I think in Latvia, we are building really good and transparent system in a way that the science works. And I hope that we have to keep this track, but also gaining more experience from our colleagues elsewhere, and specifically also from our colleagues from UK. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. I know that all of you have a really busy schedule, and thank you for giving us a great food for thought. And let's hope that we are going to meet you in 40 minutes after the break. And of course, thank you to the British Embassy, Riga. And of course, thank you for support of UK Science and Innovation Network. This has been a great pleasure. Meet you in 40 minutes. Chris, can we check if we can hear you and see you?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. We can hear you, and we start in 2 minutes. And
Great.
Again, we will start with a short introduction.
Okay, terrific.
Hello again, dear guests. It's 1:30 p.m. So we are not going to wait, and let's proceed with the second part. So welcome back to the Science for Policy, the mechanisms and opportunities of scientific advice virtual engagement. Might I remind you that this is a second part of this event. During the first one, our guest speakers, Professor Mondell and Professor Juchner, gave us an insight in how the science for policy works, both in UK and Latvia, and uncovered such crucial elements as trust, networks, science for and in policy, and interdisciplinarity, as well as the importance of excellence in science. These are all great aspects of what to keep in mind when thinking about including science in decision-making processes. And before we start with the second part of this event, kindly let me walk you through, again, a few practical points. The Q&A session is going to be after both speakers have finished their lectures or presentations. Just feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions or comments, or if you prefer, just leave a comment in the chat session, and we'll make sure to deliver it through to the speakers. And like a tiny detail is that the second part is going to end at approximately at 2:30 p.m. Now let's move on to the second part officially. I'm delighted to welcome our first guest speaker of the second part, Dr. Chris Tyler. He is a Director of Research and Policy in University College London's Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy. There, Dr. Tyler leads policy programs and digs deep in the topic of how policymakers use scientific evidence. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's wonderful to be here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the first session, and hopefully the second session will be just as interesting. I know that not all of you were in the first session, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a brief introduction to the science advisory system in the UK and a couple of other countries, just to sort of set the scene. Because I understand that Latvia is in a really exciting position of thinking about its science advisory needs for improving policy making. So that will lead on to the second part, which is about the very limited but nonetheless important things that we actually know about how science advice works in practice. And my background is in parliamentary science advice. I used to run the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, which Carol, when she was speaking, highlighted post notes as one example. We used to run those. And so I've actually have been leading an international effort to try and improve our understanding of how science works in that highly political setting of a parliament. And that obviously is closely related to how science advice works in an executive setting as well. So with no further ado, the UK is no different from most other developed democracies in that it is there's a very clear but important demarcation between the executive or the government on the one hand and parliament or the legislature on the other. And governments are typically about three things: creating policy, enacting laws, and fiscal management, whereas parliaments are focused on legislation, scrutinizing the work of government, and debating the major issues of the day. And that's that third one that's particularly important in modern democracies, where parliaments elect members to represent the public. So airing those political issues in the sort of at the apex of democratic society is really critical, and how science and technology advice feeds into that is a really important topic. So I'm going to talk about three things in each of the executive and the parliament, just as a brief introduction. Carol predominantly spoke about the government, where we have a government chief scientific advisor. At the moment, Patrick Vallance is very much in the news because of COVID, and it's his job to advise the Prime Minister directly. And that entails not just advice about science for policy, but also components of policy for science. And at the moment, obviously, his main focus is on leading mitigation and finding solutions to the COVID situation. That's taking up most of his time. He leads an office that is based in government called the Government Office for Science. And the Government Office for Science is there to support the Government Chief Scientific Advisor. And it's broadly split into two. There's roughly sort of 80 people in Go Science. Go Science is mostly sort of support functions for the GCSA, and also sort of subject-oriented advice, so that as a central science advisory body within government, it can work across government departments and coordinate scientific advice in some kind of meaningful way. There's also a relatively small group specializing in foresight and horizon scanning, whose job it is to look down the road 5, 20, 50 years even, to identify areas of strategic importance, not just with respect of emerging science and technologies, but also emerging challenges for society, for example, aging populations. And the final piece of the executive that's really critical to this, and an important component that sort of is a good marker of the English system of science advice, is these so-called departmental chief scientific advisors. Carol, you've already met at the bottom middle there, who's chief scientific advisor in the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. But every single, or nearly every single, government department in the UK has somebody who is responsible for pulling evidence into that department and distributing it to the places where it most matters. So they have a really important role in corralling evidence and expertise, and they are focal points for bringing together experts and people who can do a really solid job of summarizing research evidence and placing it into a policy context for the people who are making policies. But another thing that's a really important component of having an individual who can build relationships with a level of seniority as a science advisor is that they can work with policymakers and, crudely put, stop stupid things from happening. And it's not talked about very often as a kind of a formal part of the job description of a departmental chief scientific advisor, but in practice, it's a critical part of their role. And that is one of the reasons why Carol, among others, has been, and the UK experience has been so useful to other countries around the world, this proliferation of departmental chief scientists. Leaving the executive behind for a swift tour of our parliamentary system. The first stop is the House of Commons Library. Now, most legislatures around the world have some form of library system or research service, as they are more commonly known. In the case of the House of Commons Library Research Service, it literally started life as this library in the picture. And politicians would come in and select their books and do their own research. But over time, research services began to be added to the library work, so that now it is really there. While there is still a library and there are some librarians there, the vast majority of people in the House of Commons Library are actually researchers who provide advice to politicians, and they work across a range of topics, including science. And the bulk of the work that they do tends to be pretty responsive. So a politician will call up and say, I need advice on how the law has changed in relation to genetically modified crops, or how many people are imprisoned in my constituency, as detailed as that. There were some pretty straightforward questions that get answered quickly. There are some complex answers that take longer, but on average, 80% of that workload gets turned around within 48 hours. So it's an extremely quick advisory system. And as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of hard work churning out advice at that kind of rate. As I said, they focus on a wide range of topics. Brexit has obviously been top of the list for a while in terms of advice. So a Brexit unit was set up. But with just this year with COVID, the science team has, of course, gone into overdrive. And there's been quite a lot of proactive advice as well, trying to pull together scientific evidence, which they can't really do without the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. As I mentioned, I used to run POST, and this is a rather interesting body in the kind of the legislative science advice space, in that it is an in-house source of proactive science advice. So it specializes in telling politicians things they need to know but never thought to ask. And POST is made up of about, how is it many now? It's about 10 PhD level advisors, ranging in topics from the biological sciences, the physical sciences and engineering, through to the social sciences. And they produce these briefing papers that Carol mentioned called Post Notes, which are 4-page briefing papers that take 3 months to produce. Heavily peer reviewed, heavily researched. They are just treated as fact in Parliament, to the point where politicians I have seen who say things that are incorrect in debates will sometimes have other politicians waving a post note at them saying, you haven't read your briefing, you haven't read your briefing. They're just treated as fact by politicians who are extremely well trusted, and as a result, they inject an element of evidence into debate that otherwise wouldn't be there. And the final piece of the puzzle from a science advisory perspective in Parliament is the Science and Technology Committees. We are a bicameral house, Parliament, I should say, which means we have an upper chamber, the House of Lords, and a lower chamber, which is the Democratic Chamber, the House of Commons. I know that Latvia is a unicameral setup, the same principle of having committees that scrutinise government work is very much an important component, irrespective of the design of the House. And our science and technology committees, not only do they scrutinise policy for science, i.e. what things should government be doing to improve both scientific research and technological and engineering and innovation outputs, but they're also interested in the role that evidence plays in policy making. And in this picture, sat right in the middle is the chair, and to his left, our right, is the clerk of the committee, who is in charge of the formal running of the committee and administrative functions and the kind of the rules of committee engagement. And to the right of that individual with the rather unattractive goatee is a specialist who is a science advisor in this case, because it's the science committee. So every committee has at least one, usually two, specialist advisors who can advise the committee on their specialist subject. That's a job I held before I left to set up the Centre for Science and Policy in Cambridge. So as you can see, there's the UK system has evolved a science advisory system that is pretty distributed. It isn't just, a top down, we have a person at the top who provides advice, or we have a big, in government and in parliament. It isn't, say, the German system that relies very heavily on academies to provide advice, like in the case of COVID, Leopoldina has been extremely influential. Rather, the UK has developed a distributed system where each government department and each part of the parliamentary system has science advisors who can really help politicians and policymakers make better decisions. Now, it's just worth very quickly reflecting on a couple of small countries, because there's only so much value for Latvia in looking at the UK, because the UK is, 70 million people or so, and Latvia is, 2 million people. It's a very different scale of government. When thinking about designing a science advisory system, it's really important that you design the right system for the context that you're in, and not just cherry pick things that kind of work in other places. And New Zealand is a really interesting model, because it's a small developed country like Latvia, with a decent science background, probably not as much invested in the science landscape as you would ideally like, which is a similar situation to Latvia. But over the last 10 years, excuse me, my phone is going, I can just wait. Over the last 10 years, they've developed a science advisory system in New Zealand, which started with the appointment of a government chief scientist, Sir Peter Gluckman. And I had the privilege of spending a month or two with him in Auckland and Wellington, designing the new science advisory system for New Zealand. And because they're so heavily based on the UK system, they actually ended up opting for something that is fairly reflective of that, in that they have a government chief scientist, and then they wanted chief scientists in all of the different government departments. But they also sought out important roles for the research community and the academy, to play a key role, not just in engaging with the executive, but also working with Parliament, where there is an under-resource for science advice. So that's one interesting example of science advice. Another one is Ireland, again, similar size to New Zealand, 4 million people-ish, a bit bigger than Latvia. They've had a chief scientist for a while who is in an interesting position, because he's in charge, Mark Ferguson is in charge of both the funding body for science in Ireland, and also acts as an advisor to the Prime Minister of Ireland, the Taoiseach. And there's actually been earlier this year a call from the Royal Irish Academy, the equivalent to the Academy of Sciences in Latvia, for an enhanced Irish science advisory system with a more distributed system of science advice, so there isn't so much power and pressure put on Mark's shoulders, but rather he's in a position to provide to have support so that he can, so some of that load is lifted off his shoulders. Interestingly, they didn't call for a separation of the roles between the policy for science and science for policy, which is quite unusual in a science advisory system. I don't know why I've got two versions of that slide. Maybe I felt it was really important when I wrote it. Okay, I'm going to spend the last few minutes of my presentation talking about what we know, which I would prefix with saying is relatively little. It's not extremely well researched. Interestingly, for those of us who have been arguing for years that we need more evidence in public policy decision making, the amount of evidence for that position is rather limited. So I have been involved in a couple of projects now that are trying to reverse that situation so that the design of science advisory systems can be based on the best evidence. And the first one of these was published in 2017. It was a research project looking at the role of research in the UK Parliament that I ran out of Post in collaboration with UCL, where I now work, and ESRC, the funding body in the UK. And we really were interested in not just how evidence gets into Parliament, but but what factors shape its use, what processes, mechanisms, and cultures. So one of the things we did was conduct a survey, and we looked at a large number of MPs and MP staff and parliamentary staff, and a few members from the House of Lords. We would have liked to look at more members of the House of Lords, but just on the eve of us launching our survey that had permission from the House of Lords to launch, the head of the House of Lords got caught in a scandal involving cocaine, prostitutes, and leather waistcoats. So the House of Lords went into complete lockdown and all surveys were banned. So there's a nice little line in the report saying that due to leadership changes in the House of Lords, we were unable to conduct a survey in the members in the House of Lords. But that's for your benefit what actually happened, a very British scandal. We followed up the survey with case study interviews, and in the end, we ended up with 157 pieces of, discrete pieces of data, and that is okay. They can wait, and that is by far the biggest sample of anyone looking at Parliament in the UK, certainly, and mostly anywhere else in the world. The first thing we found is that the use of research and evidence is very different in a parliamentary setting, and indeed an executive setting, than it is in research. In research, we talk about research as a kind of a method, scientific method of doing research, and evidence is the mechanism by which that research feeds through into, for example, policy. Very different meanings in Parliament. Research can mean anything. MPs have 18-year-old kids doing research for them, which basically means drafting their letters and looking up things on Wikipedia. And evidence has a legal meaning in Parliament because it's a legal body. They talk about evidence meaning everything from scientific evidence through to testimony. So people like me and you involved in scientific research need to be careful about the language that you use when engaging with legislatures, because it means different things in those settings. We found that the vast majority of people found that research was useful, but that they like different types of research. MPs and MP staff particularly like statistics, probably because it helped them make arguments. Statistics were sort of implicitly trusted as impartial in some way, whereas parliamentary staff drew on a much wider range of research, and MPs drew on the smallest, wider type of research. Parliamentary staff were particularly interested in expert opinion. That is because their job is to synthesize evidence and place it in a policy context, and expert opinion is the easiest way to do that synthesis. We also found that academic research was woefully underrepresented in both select committee scrutiny work and in committee legislative work. The blue columns here are evidence coming in from NGOs predominantly. the charity sector, that has developed great expertise at influencing legislative activity over a long period of time. The academic information coming into these committees is green, so really underrepresented, and Parliament has taken some pretty bold steps in recent years to try and change that balance. We found lots of reasons that people used research, everything from the good stuff like supporting scrutiny and providing background knowledge and informing opinions, through to what one might reasonably label the bad stuff, like using evidence to substantiate pre-existing views and score political points. We were very lucky in that politicians were very open with us in telling us the kind of the truth about how they viewed the importance of research and evidence. There were a number of factors that affected whether or not science and evidence and research would be used. Timing was critical. It had to arrive at the right time. It had to be short. MPs just simply don't have time to delve into detailed, for example, academic papers. And that is the same of civil servants in the executive, of course. We were not surprised, but sort of disappointed that a quarter of survey respondents felt that they were either averagely or not confident in appraising research. Research skills are poor in most legislatures that I've ever worked in, and that's something that has to be dealt with from a perspective of training and selection. The most important factor for whether or not research was used is its credibility. There was a question about credibility in the first session. It's absolutely critical. People don't have time to determine whether or not determine the veracity of the information that they're receiving themselves. If they trust the source, they'll use it. So from a research perspective, developing credibility over a long period of time is absolutely critical. And that comes back to the other things like improving timing and producing short, usable information and synthesizing research rather than just providing snippets and cherry picking things that suit the points of view of the scientists. We had a number of insights from this for the higher education sector. And while this was specific to the UK, I've presented this in a number of countries around the world, and it rings true everywhere where I have spoken about it. So from the higher education sector, there's a need for better communication and presentation of research, which would be massively improved if people understood and engaged with the policy processes. Another factor is that there need to be incentives to engage. It's all too typical in academic institutions for the success or failure of a career being down to a combination, or well, mostly publication with a little bit of teaching. There aren't many incentives for a lot of academics around the world to actually engage with policymakers, and that needs to change. There are also important lessons for parliaments. What is different about scientific evidence is a question that very few politicians and an alarming number, in my experience, of civil servants actually really struggle to answer. It might be obvious to people working in research, but it isn't obvious to people with a background in, for example, linguistics or history. And educating on that point is really important. It's also critically important that there is training available for politicians, political staff, parliamentary staff, civil servants. I'm actually doing some work with various government departments on providing training on things like research methods and emerging technology, so that they can get a better understanding of how to use evidence. And it's also really important that as democratic institutions, they make the best use of formal and written evidence. We also said that more research was needed, and we went on to do that additional research, where we looked at what research questions would be really useful on legislative science advice. It turns out that nobody had really done any work on this before, and looked at what we don't know about how parliamentary science advice works in practice. So we did what all good academics do. We conducted a survey, we held a workshop, and then we performed a ranking on it. So we had roughly half of the participants from the developed world, which is where almost all the evidence is on the relationship between science and policy, and half from the developing world, where there's a real paucity of evidence. And between all of these wonderful people, who are a combination of experts working in parliaments and around policy more generally, policy brokers, policy and evidence brokers, and people working in academia, we co-designed 50 research questions that, if answered, we think would help make legislative science advice in this case better. And what we found when we analysed it is that actually the majority of the questions, when we were talking about system dynamics, were focused on how evidence is actually used and how evidence should be communicated. It turns out that it's not terribly well understood how to optimise both the use and the communication of evidence. And then when we flip that onto kind of who is involved in this process, it was the focus was on the policymakers, the institutions, and the scientists, rather on people like publishers and brokers. And I think this goes to show that even the very basics of the relationship between science and policy making are actually relatively poorly understood. And that is reflected in the fact that pretty much everyone said that the evidence base was either very poor or poor. And the kind of disciplines that were needed to answer these important questions about how to improve policymaking through the better use of evidence was interdisciplinarity was absolutely critical. It isn't just about science and technology studies and studying Yeshula Jasanoff. It isn't just about investing in public policy and those policy sciences, but also about communication sciences, sociology, psychology, anthropology, and so on. Really important role for disciplines to work with each other to improve the use of science. And I would include in that things like engineering, where ideas around systems thinking are really critical, and the kind of typically natural science dominated science advisory systems still have things to learn. We looked at just final 3 slides. We looked at some differences between what we were finding in terms of priorities for research questions in developed countries and developing countries. And as you can see from this rather complicated spider diagram, there were a pretty diverse set of priorities. What we did was, using some pretty advanced statistical methods that, I'll be honest, I don't really understand. A colleague of mine is a statistician, and she pulled these data out. We drew out from the data 3 major perspectives that explained a decent amount of the variation in the answers that we were receiving. And some of those perspectives prioritize things like evidence development and ethics, while others prioritize things like policymakers' communication and evidence use. And we found the pattern a little bit different in developing countries, where there really wasn't as much focus on things like communication and ethics. None of the perspectives really shouted about that, nor about the important role of the public. And that is important to understand some of these differences when we're thinking about designing science advisory systems. You have to understand the culture that you're working in so that you can provide something that is appropriate. But I think the most important finding that we discovered between developed countries and developing countries is that in developed countries, most people recognized that the role of science advisors was to report and then interpret the results and to integrate scientific results in policy decisions to help policymakers make decisions. In developing countries, I'll stay on developed countries. Developed countries, very few people thought that the role of the science and evidence community was about advocating for specific policies or making decisions directly about policy. In developing countries, in the absence of science advisory systems, there is a feeling that there is a much bigger role for advocacy and actually scientists making decisions. And understanding these cultural differences that are born out of not just the culture of the academic setting and the cultures of the policymaking setting, but also just reflecting the realities of the systems that are in place. So in the absence of science advisory systems and professional brokers, scientists feel that they have to advocate for specific policies. Whereas if you can put in place good quality science advisory systems, as typically exist in the developed world, that the scientists can take on a much more honest broker role, as Roger Pilkey would put it. So I'm going to finish there. And thank you for your patience as I did a whistle-stop tour through the science advisory systems and the limited research that I have done on this subject. And I look forward to answering any questions that you have. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. This was a really detailed walkthrough UK's complex system, and you are right by saying that UK and Latvia differ in so many ways, but that doesn't mean that we cannot learn from your experience. And now I would like to give a word to my colleague, Aleksandrs Martiņš-Blūms, and he's going to give an insight into science for policy from a perspective of scientific community. Aleksandrs is an expert at the Ministry of Education and Science and works mostly with social sciences and humanities, and is interested in science impact. Aleksandrs?
Thank you. Can everyone see the slides? Yes, okay. Yeah, so I work within the ministry. I work together with Anna, and I am very much involved in trying to drive an impact agenda, which is especially important for the social sciences, but equally important for all other disciplines. So my idea today is to give an overview of the ecosystem in Latvia and to look at this from the perspective of a researcher. So researchers in Latvia get funding from many different funding sources, which are programs. So we have researchers who are funded through Horizon, through structural fund programs, or through the state budget programs. And most of these research programs have explicit requirements for research impact. When we look at state budget programs in Latvia, so the state research programs, Valsts pētījuma programs, and the fundamental and applied research program, there's a very high weight for impact in these application evaluations. And we expect very diverse impact, so societal impact, economic impact, but then also we would definitely, we expect to see also some policy impact where it is relevant. So there are significant expectations for overall impact within programs, but in certain state research programs, policy impact is explicitly requested. So oftentimes within the call text, it's either stated directly, this should have an impact on policy, or which is more often the case, some of the deliverables must include policy recommendations for policymakers. And I would say that in the past, there has maybe been too much of a reliance just on producing recommendations and of that being the output instead of the next stages, which are actual policy impact. And then to help our researchers, the Latvian Council of Science has developed impact guidelines together with us. And a draft version was circulated either end of last year or beginning of this year. And we are now in the process of revising these guidelines, and there will be a very extensive practical guidance for researchers for how to get policy impact. So there will be the main policymakers listed. There will be impact pathways listed, and there will be some good examples also showcased. So how does success look like, and what's a good example of how we want this to look in practice? This is a researcher who works in the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga, Adnis Sauka. Everyone pretty much in Latvia knows who he is. And this is a picture from an event that he hosts every year. He is involved in making the Shadow Economy Index for Latvia, which is an academic project to measure the shadow economy. And every year when he has the latest presentation of his research results, he has a full auditorium, and the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, the head of the tax service, the head of all of the security agencies, all the key stakeholders are always present every year. And I asked Adnis what's the secret to his success, and he basically just said what we heard already from the previous three speakers. He said it's trust from the stakeholders that his research is of sufficient quality, that he doesn't have some kind of agenda, private agenda, and that it also offers some unique insights to these policymakers. And he said that when he started this many years ago, I think 15 or maybe 20 years ago, then it had much less engagement, and it takes time to build up this trust. And then I think it's also analogous for organizations that act as evidence brokers within the ecosystem. So my suggestion for researchers would always be to look at international guidance for how to get policy impact. And then something that shows up as one of the first links when looking for how to drive policy impact for my research is the Cambridge SRI guidance document, which I think is very useful, but it's also very UK specific, because a lot of these impact pathways that are stated don't really work in Latvia. So here I marked in yellow the impact pathways that function relatively well in Latvia, but some of the other ones don't. And if we have time for discussion at the end of this presentation, then I think it's worth maybe thinking about which of these ways of accessing policymakers we want to open up, and which of these would just generate a lot of activity but not really drive any change, which I think sometimes is the case with in the UK ecosystem, which is just very saturated with activity. So oftentimes a lot of that maybe doesn't get used. So as a researcher, who do I turn to for help? So first of all, I think it's definitely worth consulting academic peers. Latvia is very, very small. There's a saying that everyone is 2 handshakes away from any other person in Latvia. So you would probably have a colleague who has experience working with policymakers, both on the administrative and the political levels. And definitely both advice could be given and introductions can be made, and these informal academic networks should be utilized. Then there are, of course, think tanks and NGOs, which can act as evidence brokers. I think maybe think tanks haven't so much specialized in providing evidence per se, but rather advocating certain agendas. And if these agendas align, then the researcher has some reason to engage with the think tank. Then also university communication departments. To my knowledge, there aren't any public policy departments within universities specifically, but the communications departments do try to promote the research that happens within the university. And especially if the target audience is a broader audience of policymakers, then this is definitely a useful thing to use. Then we do have a post equivalent in the Latvian Parliament, the SAIMA. We have the SAIMA Analytical Service, and I will have some question to Chris after this about how researchers can specifically engage with this type of institution, because right now they produce research in-house and then deliver it to the Parliament most of the time. And sometimes they synthesize research, but then it's sort of top-down driven instead of researchers being the ones initiating the projects. And then finally, the Latvian Council of Science organizes lots of science communication events, basically showcasing what has happened within the projects that they fund. And as part of that, they're also involved in showcasing policy impact and giving a platform for researchers to engage policymakers. So what have we done within the ministry to strengthen this ecosystem? So in 2019, we organized an event in the Latvian Parliament on demography and active aging. And we had some international speakers there, and it was a very good kickoff for some other activities that we had later on. We have showcased lots of success stories. So in the LAMP festival, we had a discussion where we showcased the impact of Latvian researchers. And one of these researchers specifically had an impact on policy, which we showcased in that discussion. And then every year we have a science calendar where every month we showcase one researcher, and there's enough diversity within these researchers that there's always someone who works specifically to affect policy and to improve policy. Then as a ministry, we often have the opportunity to put forward some researchers in some international bodies or some other frameworks. And we actively make use of this. So recently, the UNESCO expert group on the ethics of artificial intelligence was looking for experts, and we were very active to nominate an expert to this. And our expert was selected for this expert group, and we always advertise this is a success story, so other researchers would also be interested in participating in fora like this. Then earlier this year in June, we had an event for researchers about how to engage policymakers on a very, very kind of specific level with specific activities. And we had both political decision makers present, we had academics present, we had Gavin Costigan from the UK who shared a little bit of what works in the UK. And this discussion, there were very, very many researchers who listened to the live stream, and then afterwards was made into a podcast, and it's been very well received. So anyone who hasn't listened to it, I would recommend listening to it. Then we've also engaged the diaspora researchers in the UK and told them about how they can access policymakers in Latvia. And of course, as policymakers ourselves, we lead by example, and we try to, as much as possible, use research evidence in our policy making. And one example of this is we're moving into this new policy area of open science. And we specifically commissioned a piece of research that will basically form the basis for our open science strategy. And then academic stakeholders will also be involved at later stages. And then with the help of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, we also funded a study on research-based evidence in the Latvian Parliament. Actually, the JRC funded it, but we defined the scope of it. And anyone who's interested in the parliamentary context specifically, I would encourage you to take a look at the study. So what are some practical tips from researchers? I think it's very important to be proactive, of course. Don't wait for the policymaker to come to you. You have to go to the relevant policymakers. It's not enough just to invite some people who have the general policy area in their titles to your dissemination event, but you have to specifically engage kind of with a more specific engagement. It's important to understand the policy context and also to find some areas of agreement, because if you completely disagree with the policy, you can't go to the policymaker and say what you're doing is completely wrong. I mean, you can try, but as a researcher, it's very unlikely that this will lead to some actual change and the policymakers will listen to you. So you have to work within their framework, suggest either some improvements on how to steer the policy ship, or yeah, I think most of the time that's a way that you can meaningfully drive change. Then in terms of communication, so the basics, so the communication has to be short and clear, no 30-page briefings. I think the post notes are about the maximum amount of information you can fit on a piece of paper that you give to a policymaker, especially for political decision makers. And then it's very important to also establish relationships and build trust, which I mentioned already before. So some ideas that I'm just throwing out. This is not a formal proposal from our ministry, but something that I think would be worth discussing is, first of all, having a chief scientific advisor network in Latvia. I think also thinking about how to strengthen the capacity of the civil service to use research evidence and strengthen links with academia for people who work in the public sector. I think it would also be very useful to have more active use of state research programs. So from those listening from abroad, basically any ministry can define the problem that they have, and we have an instrument that helps them design a research call to have some research activity within that area. But these programs don't really use formal foresight, so it's also, I think, would be quite useful to introduce foresight, and academia would be useful to be involved in that. Then there are also research studies that different ministries or other government agencies contract, and these are usually maybe 10 to 50,000 euro studies. And there definitely needs to be some support for public institutions to design these research projects. And also, once the projects are completed, they should be made available to all policymakers, and the platform where they're currently based in needs an upgrade. And of course, on something closer to what we do at the ministry, we need to keep working on better incentives for researchers to drive policy impact, and also to have these incentives in place for research institutions, because we definitely see that REF is significantly nudging UK universities to think about impact, and it would be quite useful if institutions would also have some skin in the game for ensuring that their research has policy impact. Yes, so this is all. And since on the set I'm allowed to ask some questions, then I actually have some questions for Chris. My first question is about the public consultation process. So in the UK, public consultations are quite formal. They're all available in either one or two sources. And researchers typically use this as an impact pathway to communicate their research findings and evidence to policymakers. In Latvia, this process isn't so formalized. Do you see this as something that really works, or do you see it as generating lots of activity and not really driving so much impact?
Thank you, whoever allowed me to unmute. Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that's improved in the UK over quite a number of years. As with many things related to the science advice system in the UK, lots changed with the BSE crisis in the 80s and 90s, where communication with the public was extremely poor, and that led to a massive loss of trust in everyone involved in the decision-making structure. And partly as a result of that, consultation processes were really reformed, and government does take consultations extremely seriously. Every submission gets read, and if you provide good evidence into those submissions, you stand a decent chance of influencing the policy output. I run out of STEEP in UCL, I run a policy impact unit, and we would say that consultations are really useful as part of the toolkit for influencing policy, but it's by no means the whole thing. So we would typically, for example, recently, I'll just give a concrete example because it's easy to get your head around. We've got a researcher in STEEP who's an expert on the Internet of Things and how that relates to opportunities for domestic abuse. And there was a consultation put out about domestic abuse that we helped her write a submission for, explaining how modern technology was facilitating new forms of domestic abuse. And we coupled that with sorting out a meeting with the person who was running the consultation, the grade 7 civil servant who was would ultimately be responsible for drafting the white paper relating to domestic abuse. We put her in contact with MPs who were interested in scrutinising what the government was doing on domestic abuse. And we eventually, that led to a meeting with not just the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, but with the Secretary of State responsible for that piece of legislation. So consultations are a good first step, but if you're going to really have policy impact, it needs to be part of a wider strategy.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's also, it's very logical that if the consultation process works and actually drives change, then also researchers can drive more change through the process. I have one more question, and then maybe if there are some other questions, then Anna can take over the Q&A part. I have a question about the what was jokingly called the post office, the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology. How should researchers engage with this type of organization bottom up? Because currently the service in Latvia, like I mentioned in my presentation, they synthesize research, and it's very top-down driven. So what are some mechanisms that could be put in place so researchers can bottom up make use of this type of work?
It's a great question, and I think there are many answers. I'll split it into two. There are things that Parliament can do to improve the engagement with academia. So one of the things we've done in Post as part of the grant that I oversee from ESRC that funds the social science activity in Post, we set up a knowledge exchange unit. And that unit is simply there to build bridges between the providers of evidence, or as I describe it to my grandmother, people who know shit, and how to make connections with people who make decisions about shit. And that involves training, it involves databases, it involves fellowship programs. There's a whole range of things that Parliament can do to improve not just the quality of the information coming in, but its diversity, both interdisciplinary wise, but also not just hearing from the greybeards, also hearing from younger researchers and researchers from smaller universities, not just Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial and UCL. So there are a bunch of things that can be done from the parliamentary perspective. From the research end, there are also things that can be done from a bottom-up perspective. We're blessed in the UK to have a number of science lobby groups. We have the Campaign for Science and Engineering. We have Sense About Science, which lobbies for science in public debate. We have the Science Media Centre, which provides a service for journalists to help improve the communication of science into mainstream media. And engagement between that sort of those kind of grassroots charity sector is absolutely critical. That those grassroots charity sectors work with academies and professional societies and so on. And the more that the science community engages with those bodies that have an interest and skin in the game in terms of policy influence, the better their chances as individuals at being involved in that process as well.
Thank you, very interesting. So now I hand it back to Anna. And yeah, in case there are no more questions from any participants, then I have some more questions, but it's up to you, Anna. How do you want to do this?
Of course you do, Alex.
Thank you so much. I think that we can switch to the official Q&A session. So if you have any question, please raise your hand or write it down in the chat window. I see that Talis has unmuted himself.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexander and Chris. I have actually one question to Alexander and two to Chris. So maybe I will start with the latter. So Alexander, regarding the structure, I mean, a very specific question about, how do you see the structure-wise, where this, as we call it, border organization, or the forum of where the scientists and politicians are, organizing the political decision making, should be located in Latvian science system. I mean, we are talking about, is it individual scientist chairs and the ministries? Is it something to do with national council? So that's just the structure-wise, not in terms of representatives.
I basically think that there should be many evidence brokers in the system, and I would like to see universities, at least the big universities, have a public policy unit that specifically promotes the university's research to policymakers. I think that would be quite useful, but it's of course up to the university. I do see also on the evidence demand side, I think these chief scientific advisors would be this evidence broker between academia and policymakers. And inside the parliament, if the analytical service has more capacity and could also do this, then that would be the place where that would sit for the parliament.
Okay, thank you. And then just two short questions to Chris. One is about this science and technology unit at the parliament. Are they employed or not? I mean, the scientists sitting there at this advisory board, are they employed as the staff, or they are just on the kind of not permanent basis? And the second question is, perhaps you are familiar with the GRC, a new kind of approach. They call it 2.0. How the policy and science should be organized, and the major idea is that what they suggest, as I understand, is not to just provide formal documents, from scientific advisors, but to have a more interaction at the daily kind of operational basis. And there is a contra argument that it might compromise a little bit of, how to say, integrity, because then you can lobby your specific kind of interest. So how do you see this model from your side? Thank you.
First question, actually, if you don't mind, I'll just briefly touch on the question you asked Alex about boundary organizations. Alex is exactly right. No matter where you look in the world, it's absolutely critical that you get the push and the pull right. You need people pushing from universities, and you need people pulling into policy, and you can't do it just with one or the other. On parliamentary science advisors, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology and the House of Commons and House of Lords Library and the select committees all have staff who are full-time employed by Parliament to provide science advice, and they are bureaucrats. They are not political appointees. Doesn't matter who's in power, they're there to advise, and they're actually not even allowed to be a member of a political party. It's completely taboo in the UK system for any member of staff in Parliament to be a member of a political party. And that's very different from a lot of places. I think there's some important distinctions to make here. So in most select committee systems, so I believe in Latvia, but correct me if I'm wrong, I really don't know the Latvian system very well at all, but you have standing committees, don't you? Including, for example, on education, culture and science. And I believe that they do both scrutiny work of the government and also handle legislative scrutiny. Is that correct?
Not really. I mean, but not
okay.
Well,
so
it's
it's typical that one standing committee will do both of those things. In that kind of context, politicization of the evidence is really common, because you can't really do legislation without it becoming highly political. It is, however, possible to do scrutiny without it being highly political if the committees are separate. And that's the case that we have in the UK. If you look at the US, for example, their committees do both scrutiny and legislation, and all of their advisory staff are employed by political parties. And it's a complete disaster, because you have science advisors denying the existence of climate change. It's completely pointless. In the UK system, because we have legislative committees doing their legislative stuff, and with a limited scientific input, it's not terribly good. That needs to be improved. But our scrutiny committees that are just interested in scrutinizing government, the impartiality of those advisory staff is really critical in enabling bipartisan scrutiny of government, and it works really well. The second question about GSE 2.0, I have, there are a couple of examples about kind of how to design science advisory systems that are instructive there. Most departments in the UK have a chief scientist who has a team supporting him or her, and that team then works with the various policymakers and the other sort of advisory functions like economics and legal and so on to inject evidence into the system. There are some exceptions to that. A good example is DEFRA, which is the department responsible for environment and farming and so on. And in DEFRA, the chief scientist decided to distribute the science advisors in the policy teams. And one of the benefits of that process has been a greater uptake of evidence because it's more on hand, it's part of the policy making process in a way that it isn't, for example, in the Department for Education. The downside is exactly what you pointed out, which is that there's an element of capture of the science advisors in the policy-making process, and it becomes much more difficult to distinguish between the raw evidence versus the values, or even to recognize that a lot of the raw evidence is influenced by values, which is particularly problematic in settings like the environment. How many scientists have you ever met? How many environmental scientists have you met who don't think that, for example, conservation or protecting the climate is a good thing? You know, it's part of the value system of the very research that they're undertaking. So if you would place those people with policy teams, there is that element of political and policy capture. So I don't think there's a perfect answer to your question, unfortunately, but it's something that all science advisors need to be aware of, and the more academics who are aware of their unintentional biases and their underlying value systems, the better their engagement with policymakers will be.
Thank you. It's 2:35 already, so I think if there are no more questions burning, then we should end this really fruitful discussion that we had today and all of this event actually. Last chance if anybody wants to jump in with a question. I don't see anyone. Thank you so much. I think that this event is, these kinds of events are really important for making for discussion, for making grounds of these discussions that we have to have before we can reach through and make this system of science for policy better in Latvia. So thank you so much. I think we heard a lot of great points on the push and pull system that needs to be in place, and the role of universities, that it is so crucial to have kind of academia to play a role in this whole process. And of course, as Alexandras mentioned, that building relationships is also a thing that we cannot start without. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Alexandras, for joining this event today. Thank you for all of our guests. And I hope that we are going to hear from you and that we are going to be able to make discussions like these more often. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anna. Good to see you again, Alex.